All right. The United States has invaded Nicaragua no less than 8 times. In one of these instances, the U.S. Marines occupied Nicaragua from 1926 to 1933 in order to protect U.S. business interests and put down a rebellion led by Nicaraguan nationalist Augusto Sandino. The Marines' efforts would prove unsuccessful and would be forced to withdraw from the region after Sandino successfully fought them to a standstill. Sandino was born to a poor plantation worker who had been raped by the plantation's owner. He worked in the plantations from a young age and lived in absolute poverty. Eventually, his mother abandoned him, and he was taken in by his father. After the two reconciled, Sandino was provided with an education. During this time, Sandino would witness the U.S. intervene to quell uprisings against Adolfo Diaz, who was a U.S. puppet. In 1921, after attempting to kill a rich conservative for insulting his mother, Sandino fled to Mexico, where he worked in an oil field, whose workers were organized by the IWW and led by the famous Mexican anarchist Enrique Magon. While in Mexico, Sandino studied philosophy and politics, including the works of Simón Bolívar, the hero of the South American resistance to Spanish colonialism. After the statute of limitations on Sandino's crime ran out, he returned to Nicaragua to work in the mines. When he arrived, an uprising broke out against Adolfo Diaz. Sandino joined the liberal forces in their attacks against the conservative U.S.-backed regime. More U.S. Marines were sent in 1927 to force a ceasefire between the two factions, and out of the agreement, a new National Guard was formed. Though the liberals accepted the agreement, Sandino refused to acknowledge it and continued his guerrilla campaign. Eventually, the Marines were forced to leave the country after an election that put the liberal candidate into power. Before they left, however, they put a man by the name of Anastasio Somoza Garcia in charge of the newly formed National Guard. It was Somoza who gave the order to betray Sandino while he was on his way to engage in peace negotiations with the government. Sandino was killed, and 2 years later, Somoza would seize power from the liberal government and declare himself president. Somoza was a dictator who ruthlessly defended the interests of himself and U.S. business. Somoza and his family controlled nearly half of the arable land in all of Nicaragua. He gave his National Guard free rein to dispose of political dissidents. Aside from the usual tortures and executions, the National Guard also commonly dropped dissidents out of helicopters into the crater of the Masaya volcano. In 1939, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt said of Somoza, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." In 1954, a young man by the name of Carlos Fonseca joined the PSN, which is the Socialist Party of Nicaragua. He became a committed activist and edited a university newspaper called Segovia. Within its pages, Fonseca stressed the importance of teaching the rural campesinos of Nicaragua how to read and write. The vast majority of Nicaraguans at this time were illiterate. In 1957, Somoza was attending a social club in the city of León when he was approached by a poet named Rigoberto López Pérez. López pulled out a gun and shot Somoza in the chest. López was immediately cut to pieces by a hail of gunfire from Somoza's guards. Somoza, who had ruled the country for 2 decades, died a few days later. He was immediately succeeded by his oldest son, Luis Somoza. He and his brother, Anastasio Somoza de Valle, would rule the country for the next 23 years. The Somoza family used the assassination as a pretext to further clamp down on dissidents. Marxist Thomas Borge was imprisoned for 2 years for his alleged knowledge of the assassination plot and was only freed after prolonged student demonstrations. 3 years later, the Cuban Revolution succeeded in ousting a U.S.-backed dictator, and spontaneous celebrations broke out all over Nicaragua. The Somozas moved quickly to repress these celebrations. The actions of the Cuban guerrillas had inspired Nicaraguans from various political factions to take up arms against the Somozas, including a man by the name of Ramon Raudales, who had fought alongside Sandino in the 20s and 30s. The 68-year-old Radoles was killed in combat in 1958. Many Nicaraguan groups traveled to Cuba to solicit the support of the revolutionary government. The group that ended up gaining their support was called the Committee for the Liberation of Nicaragua. Out of this was formed the 21st of September Committee for the Liberation of, the 21st of September Rigoberto Lopez Perez Brigade, which Che Guevara helped organize and which Carlos Fonseca joined. The brigade landed in Honduras with the intention of entering Nicaragua to start a guerrilla campaign. Before long, however, the group was ambushed by the Honduran military and Nicaraguan National Guard. The brigade was exterminated, and Fonseca was wounded and taken prisoner. As a result, the Socialist Party of Nicaragua completely abandoned any support of armed struggle. After being released from prison, Fonseca broke his ties with the PSN and traveled to Cuba, where he began a dedicated study of the guerrilla campaign of Augusto Sandino, and also meeting with fellow Nicaraguan revolutionaries such as Thomas Borget. Fonseca criticized the Moscow line upheld by the PSN, which refused to support revolution in Latin America. He wrote, quote, "It is a stupid kind of internationalism that only pays attention to the workers in certain parts of the world, ignoring the interests of workers in other regions, including workers in one's own country. Really, that is a caricature of internationalism," end quote. In 1963, they founded the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, or the FSLN, embracing Sandino as a forerunner to their own movement and a path to be followed. This represented a further break with the policy of the PSN, who considered Sandino a petit bourgeois adventurist. A year later, the FSLN began guerrilla operations in the Rios Coco y Boque region of Nicaragua. However, they did not speak the language of the local Sumo or Mosquito Indians and were left without support base or supply lines. The operation was a dismal failure. Those who were not killed by the National Guard fled across the border into Honduras. The FSLN's inability to work with the Mosquitos and Sumos would come back to haunt them decades later. The FSLN reevaluated its strategy, and from 1964 to 1966, their tactics were based in legal activities while still upholding armed struggle in theory. One of their victories was the election of FSLN members Casimiro Sotelo, Julio Buitrago, and David Tejeda to the head of the student government of one of the major universities in Managua, who pledged that the students would, quote, "fight to rescue the exploited classes from the clutches of the oligarchy and capitalism, advocate a just distribution of wealth, the elimination of illiteracy, and the creation of a new education system. Stand up for thoroughgoing land reform, urban reform, the nationalization of foreign businesses, and struggle to do away with the traditional political parties, which are largely responsible for the tragedy faced by the peoples of Nicaragua." During this period of legal activism, the FSLN focused on community organizing, including holding literacy classes. 1967 saw the reinitiation of the FSLN's guerrilla campaign. This time, the FSLN chose a rural, though less remote location populated by Spanish-speaking campesinos. The FSLN based its strategy on gaining the support of the campesinos for food and shelter, and stressing the importance of land reform to them. Despite these advantages, the FSLN was plagued by desertion and informants, and the 1967 campaign proved unsuccessful. At this point, the FSLN once again switched strategies, this time emphasizing urban underground activity. In 1967, Julio Buitrago left the university and traveled to Cuba, where he received military training. In a letter to his father, he wrote, quote, "I left my country not to make a living, but because I had to prepare myself to do battle against this tyranny that every day drowns the exploited masses of our country in hunger and poverty. My experience overseas, where men live like human beings, where the pueblo governs, where children do not know hunger or cold, where farmland belongs to those who work it, where there are no gangs of thugs giving tenants 2 hours to vacate their homes, where the prisons have been converted into schools, and a new world is being opened up through the labor of workers and campesinos. That experience is what has given me the strength to carry on." End quote. Buitrago returned to Nicaragua secretly in 1968 to take charge of the urban underground movement. He led a series of bank expropriations, or commonly referred to as robberies, that year. On July 15, 1969, Buitrago's safe house in Managua was discovered by the National Guard. As the Guard began their assault, Buitrago remained behind and provided cover so that 3 other comrades could escape. The assault raged for several hours. The National Guard deployed tanks, helicopters, and 300 troops against the small 2-story safe house. Somoza broadcast the attack on live television, while National Guardsmen told reporters that judging from the amount of firepower coming from the house, they had clearly found a nest of dozens of, quote, communist terrorists, end quote. When the gunfire finally subsided, the Guard entered the house and found only the bullet-ridden body of Buitrago. Somoza's broadcast was intended to show the destruction of the FSLN. Instead, he showed all of Nicaragua the bravery of a single man standing up to 300 heavily armed troops. It did not have the intended effect on the population. In 1970, when poet and FSLN member Lionel Rugamba was discovered by the National Guard, they yelled into the safe house to come out and surrender. Rugamba shouted back, "Tell your mother to surrender." These were his last words. In 1969, Carlos Fonseca was arrested in Costa Rica for bank robbery. That New Year's Eve, several FSLN members assaulted the jail in which he was being held in an attempt to free Fonseca. The attempt was unsuccessful, and FSLN members Humberto Ortega and Rufo Marin were arrested by Costa Rican authorities. In October 1970, they were freed after FSLN member Carlos Aguero hijacked an airline and took 2 North American executives of the United Fruit Company hostage. Fonseca and the rest were released in a prisoner exchange and flew to Cuba. Fonseca remained in exile until 1975. During his time in exile, he traveled along with Aguero and Marin to North Korea for political and military training, and also visited Salvador Allende's Chile. Over the next several years, various tendencies emerged within the Sandinista movement. There was the prolonged People's War tendency, of which Thomas Bourget was a part, the proletarian tendency, and also the insurrectional tendency, which was led by Humberto Ortega and which his brother Daniel also supported. In December 1974, the prolonged People's War tendency of the FSLN raided the home of a wealthy Somocista businessman named Jose Maria Castillo. 15 FSLN guerrillas broke into the house and took hostages, including President Somoza's brother-in-law and Minister of Defense. The action resulted in the release of a dozen FSLN leaders from prison. The proletarian tendency condemned the action as an adventure that only gave the Somoza regime an excuse to clamp down on student and labor activists. Factionalism within the FSLN grew more intense when the National Directorate, at the initiative of Thomas Bourget, expelled the top leadership of the proletarian tendency. In addition, peasant organizer Chico Zepeda was accused by the National Directorate of treason, and after an internal trial, was executed. It was in this state of affairs that Carlos Fonseca decided to return from exile to try to bring the factions together. Fonseca returned to Nicaragua disguised as a businessman, and upon his arrival set about organizing an offensive campaign which would reignite the guerrilla campaign in the mountains. This campaign saw some successful operations, but soon the National Guard increased its presence in the region and put the FSLN on the defensive, which in guerrilla war means running away. The Somoza government, in collaboration with U.S. military advisors, initiated an offensive in the region called Aguila Sexta. To make matters worse, an FSLN guerrilla named Roberto Chamorro defected and revealed everything he knew about the FSLN's operations in the mountains: safe houses, collaborators, supply routes, etc. On November 7th, 1976, Fonseca walked into a National Guard ambush and was killed. Just as had been done to Che in Bolivia, Fonseca's hands were cut off his corpse for identification. A National Guardsman rushed into a symphony hall and told Somoza, "General, the communist Carlos Fonseca is dead." Somoza grabbed the messenger by the shoulders and yelled, "Say it again, say it again." Somoza was convinced that with Fonseca's death, the FSLN was finished. Many other FSLN leaders were killed around this time. Edward Contrero, who had been the commander in the raid against the Castillo House, was killed the same day as Fonseca in a separate incident. And Carlos Aguero, who had hijacked the plane to free Fonseca, was killed in the mountains the following April. By the end of 1977, the entire rural guerrilla army numbered only 11. In the wake of Fonseca's death, factionalism with the FSLN hardened. The most militarily aggressive of the tendencies, the insurrectionists, led by the Ortega brothers, published their Programa Sandinista, in which they put forward a program that ditched most of Fonseca's anti-imperialist and Marxist politics and replaced them with far more moderate programs. Notably absent are Fonseca's pledges to combat discrimination directed towards the Mosquito and Sumo Indians. No mention of U.S. imperialism was made, stating only that Nicaragua will have relations with all the countries of the world. Despite this, the ranks of all the tendencies of the FSLN continued to swell in the cities. Discontent was strong in urban areas, especially after a devastating earthquake and Somoza's subsequent theft of the foreign aid received to relieve the suffering of the earthquake's victims. 10,000 people died in the earthquake. And of the $57 million sent in aid to Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan Treasury only reported receiving $16 million. While 83% of Nicaraguans were chronically malnourished, Somoza managed to find $1 million to send to Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. In April of 1978, a student strike closed down Nicaragua's universities. In August of 1978, 24 FSLN members disguised as National Guardsmen took over the National Palace in Managua and held 3,500 politicians and businessmen hostage. The action was masterminded by Eden Pastora, whose code name during the action was Commander Zero, a moniker that stuck for some time afterwards. The Somoza regime had no choice but to capitulate to the FSLN's demands and release prisoners, including Daniel Ortega and Thomas Bourget. This event was seen by many as a turning point in the struggle. Throughout the country, spontaneous uprisings were breaking out. In some places, locals rose up chanting Sandinista slogans and wearing the black and red bandanas of the Sandinistas, even in regions where no Sandinista cadre were present. The masses were rising in revolution against the Somoza regime, and the Sandinistas were the organization that they felt represented them. The massive influx of recruits had the result of pushing all three tendencies back to the left, as well as their reunification. In March of 1979, the three tendencies agreed to reorganize into a single FSLN. In June of that year, FSLN's forces converged upon Managua, and a general strike was called. Throughout the country, working-class people began violently clashing with the National Guard. As the uprisings increased, the fighters who took to the streets against Somoza began identifying themselves as Sandinistas, even if they had little connection to the actual FSLN organization. People masked in red and black bandanas, wielding Molotov cocktails, harassed the National Guard mercilessly. Somoza responded by bombing working-class neighborhoods, going so far as to command his pilots to, quote, bomb anything that moves. Tens of thousands participated in the urban uprisings, and one by one the cities began falling to the Sandinistas. To make matters worse for the Somoza regime, the National Guard executed an American reporter named Bill Stewart, an act that probably would have been blamed on the Sandinistas had it not been captured on film. U.S. support for Somoza evaporated, and he was forced to flee the country. On July 19, 1979, the Sandinistas entered the Plaza de la República in the center of Managua. Victory was declared, and a massive celebration ensued. after 44 years of the dictatorship of the Somoza family, was finally over. The Sandinista government inherited a debt from the Somoza regime of $1.6 billion. When they went to nationalize the banks, they found that only $3.5 million remained in all of the country's banks, the equivalent of 1 day of imports. Somoza had made off with the rest. They agreed to pay the debt, but it did them little good. Under pressure from Washington, the IMF refused to grant Nicaragua any aid. The United States government also cut off aid to Nicaragua. In power, the FSLN initiated land reform. They nationalized Somoza's land holdings and distributed it to cooperatives and private farmers, an act which alienated many moderates, though landowners were allowed to own as much land as they could, so long as it was not left idle and workers were paid decent wages. Food consumption was increased by as much as 100%. The death penalty was abolished. Polio was wiped out. Infant mortality was cut by 1/3. 2,500 new schools were built. A massive literacy campaign was initiated, which cut the illiteracy rate from 60% of the population to just 10%. In 1981, Reagan used Sandinista support of the Salvadoran FMLN guerrillas as a pretext to intervene once more in Nicaragua. The U.S. deployed 4,000 troops to Honduras and began arming and training counter-revolutionary armies, known as Contras. Much of these forces were made up of pro-Somoza forces, but unfortunately, as had been done in Vietnam with the Hmong, the U.S. began exploiting the differences between ethnic groups in order to create conflict. In this case, it was between the Spanish-speaking Sandinistas and the Mosquito Indians on the Atlantic coast. Historically, the Mosquito Indians had aligned themselves with the British against the Spanish colonizers. As such, many of them spoke English, but very few spoke any Spanish. Moreover, Mosquitoes were by and large Moravian, unlike these Catholic Spanish speakers. Moravian priests held large sway over the Mosquitoes and spread anti-communist and pro-US propaganda amongst them. To make matters worse, many Spanish-speaking Nicaraguans held racist views of the Mosquitoes, a problem that was not alleviated by them being supportive of the Sandinistas. And to the discredit of the Sandinistas, literacy programs were not made available to the Mosquitoes in their native tongue, but only in Spanish. Many Mosquitoes saw the Sandinistas as a threat to their aspirations of sovereignty and feared that they would be forcibly assimilated into Greater Nicaragua. The Sandinistas suffered from an ethnocentric understanding of indigenous peoples, thinking that the proletariat were the future of the country, leaving little room for traditional lifestyles of indigenous peoples. The Mosquitoes responded to this conception in one of their manifestos. Quote, "We declare that as national indigenous peoples, we have a system of land use based on social, not individual factors, in profound agreement with all the biblical teachings in the New and Old Testament on the possession and the use of land. Thus, the possibility is eradicated of the domination of some people over others based on the individual exploitation of the means of production. All production, fruits of labor, or the use of natural resources, the entire economy, is based on the subsistence needs of the people, not on profit. We produce in order to live, and we do not work for profit. Thus, in a subsistence economy, not a get-rich one." End quote. Tensions and misunderstandings came to a head when a confrontation between Sandinistas and Mosquitoes in a Moravian church turned violent. In 1982, Stedman Fagoth and 3,000 other Mosquito Indians crossed the northern border into Honduras, where they began receiving aid from the United States to wage guerrilla war against the Sandinistas. Tensions were further exacerbated when the Sandinistas relocated thousands of Mosquitoes away from the Nicaraguan border. This was done in order to prevent large amounts of civilian casualties in their war with the Contras. Still, some were outraged by what they perceived as a displacement of the indigenous population, a belief that was not alleviated when certain Sandinista authorities made comments suggesting that relocation would probably be an improvement over the primitive lives of the Mosquitoes. FSLN leader Eden Pastor became disenchanted with the Sandinistas, which he felt were doing little to assist the campesinos and indigenous tribes that he had fought for. Pastora switched sides and began fighting against the Sandinistas in southern Nicaragua, loosely federated with the Contras based out of Honduras, though Pastora was disliked by Washington and received little U.S. aid. In practice, the Contras were brutal, specifically targeting and murdering midwives, health workers, and peasants who were assisting in land reform. In 1984, elections were held and Sandinista Daniel Ortega was elected. In 1985, Reagan imposed an illegal embargo against Nicaragua. Fuel became scarce in the country, and export crops often never left the country. In 1986, when it became unavoidably clear that the Contras were committing massive human rights violations, U.S. Congress prohibited Reagan's support of the Contras. This triggered the Iran-Contra affair, when it was exposed that Reagan was selling arms to Iran in exchange for the release of hostages and millions of dollars, which were then funneled to the Contras. During the hearings, Reagan developed a case of memory loss, protecting himself from taking any responsibility for the scandal, and emerged from the affair unscathed. Allegations of Contra drug trafficking emerged at this time as well, charges which the CIA attempted to put entirely on Eden Pastora. In 1989, Washington committed electoral blackmail when it pledged to continue the embargo if the Sandinistas were re-elected. In 1989, a war-weary Nicaragua voted out Daniel Ortega in favor of a broad opposition alliance. Only once the Nicaraguans capitulated to the will of the U.S. did the economic and guerrilla warfare against their country cease. After the Sandinistas left power, the illiteracy rate soared back to 30%. Ortega, who remained head of the Sandinista party, began cooperating with the right wing of the country. Arnoldo Alemán, a conservative who served as president from 1997 to 2002, was found guilty of massive corruption and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Ortega, however, assisted Alemán in getting out of jail and later acquitted of the charges. In 2006, Ortega was re-elected president with 37% of the vote, less than he had received in his 2 unsuccessful bids for president. As president, Ortega began pandering to the Catholic Church, going so far as to outlaw abortion. Many former Sandinistas are now wealthy businessmen, including Daniel's brother, Humberto Ortega. Eden Pastora has switched sides once again and now supports Daniel Ortega's presidency. In 1995, the Sandinista Renovation Movement was formed to oppose Daniel Ortega's Sandinistas party, whom they felt had betrayed the Sandinistas' original principles. However, both parties are essentially center-left. Nicaragua is now the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and 1/3 of its population is malnourished. Ortega has initiated relations with anti-American countries such as Iran and is supportive of Chavez and Morales. Chavez, for his part, donates oil to Nicaragua. Literacy classes have been reinitiated in the rural areas of Nicaragua. The story of Nicaragua is a long and brutal legacy, which leaves little room for oversimplifications. While it could have been the first Latin American country to join Cuba in a united socialist and anti-imperialist bloc, instead it was mired in war for decades, starved and punished for having the audacity to assert its right to determine its own future. Perhaps without CIA involvement, tensions between the mosquitoes would have been resolved peacefully and easily. Perhaps without a U.S. embargo, the Sandinistas would have been able to pursue more hardline socialist policies. The fact of the matter is that now we will never know, but this only underscores the responsibility of revolutionaries the world over to bring an end to U.S. imperialism, so that next time we won't be left wondering. Thank you. You guys just want to ask me questions, or would you rather break into groups and discuss amongst yourselves?
Lecturer's choice.
I was just asking what you guys thought.
We'd like you to decide.
All right, ask me questions.
I think groups is probably better.
All right, break into groups.
You want to count us off?
Sure.